let's begin. Welcome everybody to, fourth session of the 26th round of the ABT framework course. And we're going to begin with Mr. Matt giving us a quick little, where are we with story circles?
Working circles. We have released the week one participation sign-up list. So you can start signing up to participate in working circles. As a reminder, we want you to host one working circle, and sometime before the end of the course, sign up to participate in at least 2 working circles. Though really you can sign up for as many as you want. And we highly, highly, highly encourage you to sign up for working circles in which you have zero expertise. So NOAA people, sign up for FAA working circles. FAA people, sign up for no working circles. You can also sign up for working circles from some of our other partner groups. We also have the World Bank and a bunch of medical schools in Georgia, the CTSA, the Clinical Translational Science Alliance, something like that. I'll get it one of these days. So please, the more that you sign up for working circles in which you don't have expertise, the more you'll be able to see how these narrative dynamics work, because it's so much easier to see how they work when you're not completely enmeshed and tied into all the information. When you're kind of like the outsider looking in, it's so much easier to see how these narrative dynamics work than when you have your brain kind of just gummed up with all the data and details of a topic. So and one more note, FAA people, I know you have some problems with the firewalls, like getting through to sign up. So I'm going to keep doing like I've been doing every week. Every week when I send out the weekly reminder that class is going to be in a couple hours, I'll attach to that a spreadsheet with the new working circles that you can sign up for. And if you can't get to the sign up page, just email me and let me know which ones you want to sign up for. I'll sign up for them for you. I think that's all I got for today, Randy.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Matt. And let's get going. I am just back from a week in Nepal that I spent with the World Bank, doing 2 retreats that they had in ABT stuff with them. The first one was this amazing group here, their Sustainable Development Leadership Team. We spent 3 days with them up in the mountains and then came down to the lowlands and did another 3 days with their South Asia Water Group. And it's very fitting because the first big story I'm going to tell you here is from the World Bank. And it was kind of fun to share this story. I've been telling people I've been piecing it together for about 3 years. So we're going to get in deep on that. And what we're doing here, the first half is going to be lecture. Second half will be 3 ABTs that we got lined up for today. And so we're moving forward on the ABT development model. This is our 3-step process for strengthening the ABT. Last time we got into step 1, which is the singular narrative, how you begin the ABT. This time we're going to do step 2, which is you go backwards. And this is the main principle to know, is that ABT, you don't start with the A and then go to the B, go to the T. You go right into the middle, as you know, the problem. So we did a bit on the singular narrative, the but. Now and remember I introduced the Dobzhansky template as a tool for getting your theme, the whole core of what your ABT is about, down to a single word or term or concept. And so now we're going to step 2 here, which is go back and fix your setup. And that's the key point, is that you can't figure out how to set up your narrative till you know what the problem is. Once you've got the problem, it tells you everything in both directions. It tells you what you need to set it up, and then it also eventually tells you what actions you need. Once you know the problem, you know what you need to fix it. So we'll be getting into that with ABTs today. Okay, so the setup, and the setup consists of 2 main parts. We'll talk about them in detail. The first part is just the ordinary world, and I'm going to eventually tell you where this term, the ordinary world, comes from. We'll be getting into that. I want to begin with what I label nowadays as a cautionary tale, and this is the thing from the World Bank. It's a little bit about beware of institutional culture. That's things get entrenched and they get pretty hard to change. So this is about the word and the World Bank story. There's 3 chapters to this. The first one's a plague of ands. Second is the Paul Romer to the rescue, their chief economist. And then the 3rd chapter is exit Paul Romer. So that's the whole arc we're going to cover. Chapter 1, a plague of ands. Here's what happened. 2015, there's a project at Stanford University called the Stanford Literary Lab, where they are now pulling together all these linguistics analysts to study what they call the corpus, all of the world's literature, all digitized into one supercomputer where you can search it for whatever patterns and things you think might be interesting. So two of the folks in this project decided to take a look at some of the most unreadable, impenetrable documents on the planet, the annual reports of the World Bank. And they're so bad the way they're written that they've got a whole term they've developed there. And the fun thing is that last week I kind of ground truth everything I'm going to tell you here, ran it by all of the World Bank people, and they all nodded their heads, said, yep, you got it exactly right. So they call it bank speak, the whole way in which they communicate there that is so hard to follow. The World Bank was formed in 1946, right after World War II, to help developing nations and recovering from the war in the beginning. And now it's really about developing nations. And what they did was they looked at all the way from the start to 2012, the annual reports, and they searched these for keywords, but more importantly, they search what they call co-locates. So for example, the word governance, what they would do is look at what are the most common words that crop up right next to governance. So they expected to see words like corporate governance or authoritative governance or democratic governance. What they found, to their surprise, for all these keywords was the most common word that cropped up right next to them was the word and. So, that's where there's a fork in the road between them and us, which is that literally they looked at this word and said, this is a garbage word. Who cares? Why are we seeing and all over the place? To us, it's one of the three words of the ABT. It's the most important of words. So complete difference in that. In the report that they had, you can find it online, the last section they titled and, which is kind of fun because they published in 2015. About that same time, I was writing my Houston We Have a Narrative book and coining the phrase in there also of and completely independently of them. And we abbreviated AAA. And here's what they said in this one section that kind of summarized what I'm talking about. They said, we've discussed the co-locates of governance. Back then, we didn't mention that the biggest surprise of all came with the most frequent co-locate of all, and the most frequent word in English is the. Everybody knows that. So what is and doing at the top of the list? Two passages from the 99 report may help explain. And so their report from 1999 was just one they used as an example to take a look at the style. And what you see here is promote corporate governance and competition policies and reform. And there's your and pattern brought to life in these annual documents. So here's the big challenge. Everybody get ready to type into the chat window your answer to this multiple choice question, which is, what is the ideal frequency of the word and? It turns out that the literary world has studied this. And when you look at a document, if you count up all the words in the document, what would you think if it's really well edited? For example, editors from articles in the New Yorker, and Matt and I have tested this at great length. What would you predict would be the frequency of the word and? What percentage of all the words would be and? As a percentage of total words, would you guess it would be 7%, 2.5%, 1%, or 0.5%? You could just put the letter in there, A, B, C, or D. Let's see what we get there in the chat window. Everybody put your guesses in. And I'm seeing some, let's see here. We got B, C, B, C, B, C, letter B, C is a D, C, B, 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 B. Nobody guessed A, 7%. Everybody homing in on B and C, pretty much going with the mid-range values there. And that is just a little exercise to have you give it some thought. Here's the answer, 2.5%. And I just find this endlessly fascinating. And I really would encourage you to lock it into your mind for the rest of time and even try and use it for your writing, because it's very simple to figure it out for any document that you write. If you've written a lengthy report, and when we finish today, you really ought to go look at it. If you've got any lengthy reports on your computer, just throw it in the word processor, search the word and with a space on either side, and divide that by the total number of words and see what you get. You ought to be around 2.5%. The problem is lots of government reports, not very well edited, just thrown together, and you see this value drift up and up. And look at what happened there at the World Bank. Was over the course of decades, it went up. In the beginning, it was 2.5%, and that's the ideal value. By 2012, it had drifted. Some of the years it was all the way up to over 5%. That means 1 out of every 20 words in the document is the word and. That's a lot of anding. So there's the basic pattern. that study came out 2015. Chapter 2, Paul Romer to the rescue. So they hired a new chief economist, very smart guy, Paul Romer, was hired away from Columbia University in 2017. And as soon as he got there, somebody gave him that report and said, look what's going on here. Your whole agency around the world, which is enormous. It's in 180 countries. There's 10,000 employees. And he looked at that study and said, well, it's very simple. He was the head of their research committee that approved all these reports to come out. And he put out an edict and said, from here on out, no reports are going to be released from the World Bank until the frequency of AND gets down to 2.6 or lower. Well, you can imagine what happened to the old guard, the people that have been there for years and years, which is, you're telling us the most important criteria for writing these reports is this dumb word "and" that means nothing. It's a trash word. And again, not a single one, not even he, had any idea about ABT, that "and" was an important word structurally for narrative. And so he was kind of swinging in the dark. He only knew that this was not reflective of good writing. And basically, this is his philosophy. I think I'll change this deadly boring culture of the World Bank. Not going to happen. So what happened was they rose up and got him booted off this committee that he'd just taken over. And it got so bad, there was a lot of terrible memos exchanged back and forth, that the Economist, lots of different publications did articles. This is the one from the Economist. And you can see the basics here. Spat over language erupts at the World Bank. And note the subtitle, but arguments over an excess of conjunctions may miss the point. Well, that's the writer's opinion. There's the same graph that I showed you from the paper. There's how they had it in the Economist. And let's look at this paragraph down here. It says, war of words has flared up. Paul Romer, its new chief economist, has been stripped of control of the research division. Internal memo claimed the change was to bring operations closer together. But many think it was because Mr. Romer clashed with staff over the bank's writing style. He had the audacity, basically, that's the way I would have worded that. He had the audacity to demand shorter, better written reports. Imagine that. In the most recent spat, Mr. Romer questioned the excessive use of the word "and." Well, this writer also did not understand any significance about "and." And notice in the top left corner, they've labeled this conjunction dysfunction. They thought it was silly that there was such a flap over the word "and." And the writer said that what the real story was, that person felt, was, you look at that bar graph over there and you see that a third of the reports are never even downloaded. They felt that was the real story. Well, that's because they don't have any narrative structure. They're unreadable. And that's what just didn't come across. At any rate, Paul Romer got so disgusted with everything there. I tried to interview him in 2018. He wouldn't answer my emails. I got a hold of the chief information officer. A couple of days later, he came back and said, I talked to Dr. Romer, and is so fed up with this whole thing, doesn't want to talk to anybody about it. So he wouldn't give any info. But I got a hold of the two authors of that study, and the lead author, Moretti. I spoke to him. He had just retired, moved to Switzerland, but a great guy, and we had a good laugh about it. And he also didn't know the first thing about ABT. And his take on it was that it was more about "and" as a word of kind of erasing contradiction. So here's the lessons that I think to be learned from this story. Is first off, non-narrative types are not going to grasp a narrative critique. This is important for all of you with your institutions at NOAA and FAA. Be careful going out and telling everybody, we got to change the style of what we do here, if they don't themselves understand narrative structure. That's a real danger. That's what happened there. He tried to impose a narratively driven rule in which he didn't even quite understand what was going on, and they didn't even come close to it. Of course, guess who had the last laugh of that whole flap? He went back to his post at Columbia University in 2018, and the next year won the Nobel Prize in economics. So, and it's interesting because last week, a number of people in World Bank that I was working with there knew him, said he's a really great guy, very smart. One of these days, I'm going to get in touch with him and talk to him about this. The moral of the story is careful what you try to change. And we've found this a little bit with Genentech, where I worked with them 4 years ago. And they have a culture there where they routinely start their internal presentations with a slide that'll have like 6 graphs, and they don't even bother with setup and any of that sort of stuff. I worked with them to try and restructure some talks to give them better narrative structure. They were great. They gave all their 12 of them. I had a dual symposium one day, but a year later, I talked to the head guy, and he said, well, if you don't start your talk with 6 graphs, people think you're a lightweight. So they all reverted back to that to some extent. I thought we had no effect at all there, the work that I did. But turns out last spring, they got in touch and said, actually, we had a big impact on their biostatistics program. The bottom line of all that is they're one of the 4 rounds we're running right now. So they really are getting it in some ways. It just takes time. And here's what I said: at best, the jungle reclaims all; at worst, it eats you alive. So got to be careful about that. Now, From there, we're going to go into deeper on the setup and what the and section is there, the blue material at the beginning of your narrative. It's the single word for it is context. It's setting up the context of the whole problem that you're going to do. And it's made of two main things: this ordinary world, what it is basically you're working on, and then secondly, what's at stake, what's important. We're going to focus mostly on the ordinary world stuff for today and give you a little bit of background where this comes from. So this narrative structure stuff is not something that's cropped up in the last few years. This goes back thousands of years. These are principles you cannot defy. The article I think I mentioned to you that I had in MedPage 2 weeks ago, this is what I was trying to say. I cited Gilgamesh in that article. I don't think anybody read it. The biomedical world really doesn't want to hear this stuff. But you can't just make up these communication rules off the top of your head. Okay, we're going to go ahead and just ram information in people's heads. It's not going to work. You've got to respect the thousands of years. I've talked to Oscar-winning screenwriters in Hollywood who have said the same thing to me. At the end of the day, you've got to respect what the Greeks figured out and goes all the way back to 4,000 years ago, these principles of how our brains are programmed. So they emerged originally in the telling of stories, and the storytelling tradition in the beginning wasn't written very much, other the few things like Gilgamesh, but in general, it was mostly the oral tradition handed down in tribal communities, things like that. The elders would tell the stories, the kids would kind of imprint and pick them up over the ages, and they become elders themselves. And a lot of it was not written down. So as a result, the idea of telling stories was very holistic. Nobody figured out any principles, any structural things. The Greeks figured out a couple of things about their plays that they put together. But in general, there's a tendency to be more holistic. Wasn't until really the last few decades that people have gotten much more analytical about it. We've gotten to the point now, with computers, you can analyze everything. And that's what's going on nowadays, is much more analytical approaches. Now, before everybody got super analytical, but one of the first guys to bring a more scientific analytical approach to stories and to begin to realize that there's a structure inside of stories, which is the ABT, everything that we're working on here, was Joseph Campbell, about a century ago, legendary mythologist. And in the 1930s and 40s, he did his prime work. In the late 40s, published his masterpiece titled The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And this book, he basically posed a very simple question that he went around the world pursuing. He posed the question of, do the different cultures and religions around the world tell different stories? Nice, simple hypothesis. The idea that, the Greek stories were completely different from what gets told in the Hindu culture, different from the Incas and yada, yada. And he eventually came up with a fairly simple answer to this, which is basically no. Everyone is telling the same story. In the late 80s, he was interviewed at great length by Bill Moyers and PBS. And in those interviews, he says this over and over again, that everywhere I went, I began to realize we're all telling the same basic story. Thus, the title of his book, Hero with a Thousand Faces. Everybody's telling the same basic hero story that just has different faces for different cultures. So at the beginning of this very important book, this is a little quote that I pulled out that I think is very important. He says, there are, of course, differences between numerous mythologies and religions of mankind, but this book is about similarities. Now, that's interesting as well, that's a choice that you make. Do you want to sit there and marvel at, oh my goodness, look at how different these stories are in Mexico versus, in South Africa or something like that, these cultural stories? Yeah, there's lots and lots of difference. The names of characters is completely different, the setting and things like that. But when you look at this internal structural stuff, that's what he was looking at. What he was stunned by was the amount of similarity. It's basically the same story, out of which he eventually compiled it all together into this one template that he called the monomyth. And it's that idea that they're singular. There's just one basic myth that gets modified all around the world. And when you study evolutionary biology, when you studied comparative zoology, comparative anatomy, you see the same basic things, the idea of singular body plans that are radiated out in all different sorts of forms. And if you look backwards in time, you can see, wow, they originally were all the same thing. That's what he saw, that same sort of comparative forms for one central plan at the beginning that gets radiated in all the different cultures. And that central form is the monomyth, which is what we're going to go through now. And this is worth committing to memory. I'm going to talk you through it first here, and then I'm going to show you half of a really nice little video that we'll review it again. So the monomyth is the idea that a story basically consists of a circular journey. It begins one place and ends in the same place. It goes on a circle, and it's one character who's off on this journey, and it goes through 3 phases. So the first phase, Joseph Campbell labeled as the ordinary world. That's a term that we use because it's kind of a nice little term. And what he meant really was the non-narrative world. This is before we've got a problem. This is the peaceful world. This is, we've already mentioned the Matt template. This is before we get to the problem. This is the happy heavenly world of heaven and heaven that Matt's template points to. And that's how a story begins. So if it's a murder mystery, basically, it mostly begins in a kind of calm world where everybody's hanging out and having a good time. But then a problem arises, which is you find a dead body. And all of these stories have got this moment that happens where it activates the brain. And that's when we start off on this word narrative, which I've defined as the series of events that occur in the search for the solution to this problem. So the lower half of the circle is the narrative, the journey. Joseph Campbell referred to this as the special world. And very important characteristics to be aware of is the ordinary world is peaceful, it's serene, it's where it's nirvana, basically. You have no problems whatsoever. It's what you dream of. As soon as you cross in, a problem arises, you cross into the special world. The special world is much more exciting. It's invigorating. Your brain is active now because you've got a problem. The simplest way to think of it is the Wizard of Oz. Dorothy is living her boring, peaceful life there in Kansas, and then gets taken to the land of Oz. When she lands there, what happens? She goes out the door of the house, and it's all colorful and lively, and it's an exciting place. But there's one problem, which is you can never be comfortable in the special world. You've got this problem that's excited your brain, and you can't sleep at night. You're trying to solve it. And so as exhilarating and fun as the special world is, you're never comfortable there. You're always trying to figure out, how do I solve this thing? And that's in the Wizard of Oz. The whole movie is her sitting there in Oz, and you might think, wow, look at this happy place. They all worship her and it's all colorful. And that's eventually what happens. She kind of solves all the internal problems of Oz, and it looks like it's a great place to live forever. But she's still got that fundamental problem, which is she wants to get back to her ordinary world. And that's what's deeply programmed into people. And so you undergo this journey down the lower half of the circle, and it's one thing after another. If it's a murder mystery, the journey consists of one suspect after another you're pursuing and ideas. If it's a scientific investigation, you pose your problem, your question at the beginning there, and then you set off in the narrative part of your journey, pursuing one hypothesis after another. I think it's this. You do an experiment, and it's not that. Therefore, I'm going to go here. And you see that bottom part is all buts and therefores. But maybe it's this. Therefore, I'm going to do this experiment. But that experiment showed that it's not that. Therefore, I'm going to do this. On and on and on until eventually you find your way to the solution. And then once you do, you go back for the third part of the journey, and you're back in that ordinary world, which is much more cerebral. There's nothing upsetting you. The visceral part calms down and you can think again. And as a result, this is what you get in stories: is the cerebral part is the beginning and the end. The beginning, it gives us a whole setting that we can think about. And then at the end, it pulls everything together and synthesizes it. And that's where you get the kind of moralizing that goes on at the end of the story. So there's a really deep dynamic that goes on with all that. Now, what we're going to do here is show you the first 2 or so minutes of this great little TED Ed video that was made about 10 years ago. And it speaks for itself. We'll review basically what I've just told you there. So Matt, let me know if there's any audio problems. Otherwise, here we go.
What do Harry Potter, Katniss Everdeen, and Frodo all have in common with the heroes of ancient myths? What if I told you they are all variants of the same hero? Do you believe that? Joseph Campbell did. He studied myths from all over the world and published a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, retelling dozens of stories and explaining how each represents the monomyth, or hero's journey. So, what is the hero's journey? Think of it as a cycle. The journey begins and ends in the hero's ordinary world, but the quest passes through an unfamiliar, special world. Along the way, there are some key events. Think about your favorite book or movie. Does it follow this pattern? Status quo, that's where we start. 1 o'clock. call to adventure. The hero receives a mysterious message, an invitation, a challenge. 2 o'clock, assistance. The hero needs some help, probably from someone older, wiser. 3 o'clock, departure. The hero crosses the threshold from his normal, safe home and enters the special world and adventure. We're not in Kansas anymore. 4 o'clock, trials. Being a hero is hard work. Our hero solves a riddle, slays a monster, escapes from a trap. 5 o'clock, approach. It's time to face the biggest ordeal, the hero's worst fear. 6 o'clock, crisis. This is the hero's darkest hour. He faces death and possibly even dies, only to be reborn. 7 o'clock, treasure. As a result, the hero claims some treasure, special recognition, or power. 8 o'clock, result. This can vary between stories. Do the monsters bow down before the hero, or do they chase him as he flees from the special world? 9 o'clock, return. After all that adventure, the hero returns to his ordinary world. 10 o'clock, new life. This quest has changed the hero. He has outgrown his old life. 11 o'clock, resolution. All the tangled plot lines get straightened out. 12 o'clock, status quo, but upgraded to a new level. Nothing is quite the same once you're a hero. Many
Sorry about that. My Zoom, I lost the thing. Okay. Are we back on there, Matt?
We're back on. You're good.
Okay. Sometimes the cursor goes away. Okay. So that's the basic hero's journey and the 12 stages they break it into, which is pretty standard. And just one little thing, look down there at the bottom, the 6, it's often referred to as the darkest hour. And that's the most powerful part of the story. Usually it's when the hero's, way deep down the drama and you're not sure you're going to make it. Just a fun little anecdote. I graduated from film school, USC, 20 some years ago now. And a couple of years ago, we had a reunion, a whole bunch of us that graduated at the same time, about 7 or 8 of us for brunch on a Sunday morning. And I kind of took over at the start and I said, all right, let's do something fun here. Since we graduated, let's go around the table. And instead of telling everybody, all the job, well, I went here and then I went here and then I went here, just tell us one thing. Tell us the story of your darkest hour since graduating from USC Film School. And the stories that came out were horrifying. And I don't have the time to share it with you, but basically all kinds of harassment and abuse. Welcome to Hollywood. Every single story, people's jaws were dropping. But you want to get to the most powerful, most dramatic material. It's right down there at stage 6. And that's what pulls audiences in quite often is, give us that moment of real contradiction. So again, to look at those 3 stages, the first one is kind of all the blue peaceful. The journey is there driven by the contradiction. And eventually you get to the therefore, what it all means. That's the overall structure of the hero's journey. So I wanted to go through all that to kind of get that formed in your head. Matt, maybe have you already put the link into the window? You can all watch that video again on YouTube, and you should really watch it a lot. I mean, I was just sitting here thinking this is probably about the 40th or 50th time I've given this presentation since we started the course and the start of the pandemic. And each time I sit here and watch that video and new things kind of plop into my head. There's so much to that little 2.5 minutes there. It's very dense.